I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, Luis Vivanco, who is a professor of anthropology and co-director of the Humanities Center at UVM. He has published extensive scholarship on bicycle culture, politics, and history. His lecture tonight draws from archival research he began for his book entitled Reconsidering the Bicycle, an anthropological perspective on a new old thing, which was published in 2013. And he's currently preparing several publications based on that research and has also developed a bicycle tour in Burlington to complement his lecture. And as you already know, he's also an accomplished graphic novelist. So with all of that said, please join me in welcoming Professor Vivanco.
Keep you from getting too restless. That's why I gave you comics. And you can take them or leave them. You can, if you leave them, just put them back here on your way out, or you can take more, because I gave you one of each so that you could share with your neighbors, and if you like them, take more. Give them to your friends. And they're foreshadowing some of the themes, some of them quite humorous and others quite serious that I want to talk about tonight. But so I am a cultural anthropologist. Katie nailed it. And why a cultural anthropologist gets interested in bicycle history, there is probably where I should start, because my background as an cultural anthropologist is I study social movements. I study environmental activists, primarily in Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist in my focus. So I worked for a number of years in Costa Rica and Mexico. And I was studying the course of environmental movements at the community level, the politics of sustainability, the rise of sort of green attitudes in policy arenas and so on. And one day, it struck me that my everyday practice of riding a bicycle was somehow re-signified, re-symbolized as a green activity. And so it struck me, well, I'm a scholar of green movements, and I should probably dig around in that. And so I started digging around in that and found it to be fascinating territory to explore the ways in which social movements interact with the bicycle. And it led me to do field work. We do participant observation work, and I did quite a fair amount of time in Bogota, Colombia, studying bike activists there. I've been to Denmark to look at that whole situation. And at the same time, I was starting to do field work in Burlington. And Burlington has undergone a community-wide debate now for about 10, 12 years about the status of bicycles and how far do we go down the road of promoting more bicycle use in the city. And so I was doing field work among everyday bike riders, and I was hanging around bike shops, and I was on the board at Local Motion at the time, and so I was doing a lot of insider sort of ethnography of how bike activists and advocates work in Burlington. And I decided to write a book, and whoops, I got to change this, don't I? So I started to write this book called Reconsidering the Bicycle, an Anthropological Perspective on a New Old Thing. And I did some case studies in there of different cities around the world that are taking the bicycle seriously. And so I did a case study on Burlington, and I knew in my research that in the background here in Vermont, the bicycle craze of the 1880s and 1890s was a thing. It was a big thing, actually. But I just knew the general outlines of it, and I naively thought, oh, I'll find some scholar has written something. Somebody did a master's thesis, let's say, in history at UVM, and I was digging around. I couldn't find anything. At the time, there was not even a good history of Burlington. There is now by Vince Feeney. But I was like, oh, no, I'm going to have to do this myself. So I dive into the archives at Special Collections at UVM, which is the biggest archive in the state of certain kinds of materials that were interesting to me. City directories, letter collections, photo collections, maps. I never knew anything about Sanborn maps. Sanborn maps are these fire department maps that were created so fire departments knew what was what in a town, in a city. So I'm digging into all this stuff, and I found this mountain of material that was totally untapped. Nobody was writing about this, talking about this. And so I thought, well, I'm going to put a little bit of that, just a teeny bit of that into my book. And then the rest of it, I got to do something with it. And so I developed this talk. I developed a bicycle history of Burlington bike tour. And lately I've been doing comics. And because these stories are just bursting with interesting themes. And so what I hope to do tonight is to introduce you to some of those interesting themes. And I'll say this, that you don't have to be a bike nut like me to find this material fascinating. I'm an anthropologist first and foremost, and so the bicycle is a really useful lens to look into social transformation. And what we'll find is that the bicycle was this protagonist of all kinds of interesting social changes. So we'll start with this. And the bicycle arrives, as best we can tell, in Vermont in 1860, late 1860s. And there was a velocipede school that was being advertised in St. Albans. And it was only open for a couple of days. No one knew how to ride these things. And if you'll open, this is part of what I wanted to give you the little blue book for, is if you want to picture what that bicycle looked like that people were riding, the history of the bicycle in the 19th century is on that first page. And so in 1817, I'll start from the beginning. In 1817, this German nobleman named Karl von Drais, you've heard about the year without summer in 1816 because of a volcano that blew in Indonesia in 1815. Well, in 1816 in Germany, this nobleman's like, hey, all these horses are dying because the oats are failing. There's no harvest. And so he says, we need a replacement for the horse. And so he creates this thing that he called it was called a draisine, but it was a running machine. And so it 2 wagon wheels with a big piece of carved wood there and a seat and some handlebars. You'll notice there are no pedals. There's nothing, there's very little steering control. Basically, if you got in a rut, you were stuck in that rut. And you put your legs up and you hoped for the best if you're going down a hill. There were no brakes. And they were also known as dandy chargers because dandies, wealthy men in London and New York and Paris were picking up on these. So it was quite a fad, the dandy charger. And in the late 18th, or in the mid 1860s, someone brings in one of these things broken down to a Paris wagon wheel shop. And some curious and enterprising mechanic there, a guy named Pierre Lallemand, decides to see if he could develop some way to make it self-powered. And so he basically cranks in a pedal on that front wheel. And that is the bicycle that starts arriving pretty quickly to these shores and arrives at least in St. Albans in the late 1860s. So not long after it was invented, it's already here. And they were known as bone shakers because they were about 150 pounds and they were really, bouncing around because they were wagon wheels for the most part. And so we have that. So then what happens next in the technological development of the bike is that people want to go faster. And the way to get faster on a direct drive wheel is grow that wheel. And so that's what you see here. Cornell Nellie Ross from Rutland in 1885, standing proudly with his Rudge, which is a very fine bicycle. That bike is developed in the 1870s, and what goes along with that is they have to figure out how to make that tire lighter, that wheel lighter, and so that's when we find tension spokes are invented to accommodate that. These bikes were the first sort of bikes that you saw touring around the countryside of Vermont. They were dangerous bikes, as you might guess. The term header came about because these bikes would hit a bump and they'd fly over the front and land on their heads and sometimes kill the rider. And so the fourth bike that you see here is the so-called safety bicycle. Which was invented in 1885. This is a Rover safety bicycle. And it's the basic design, diamond frame, chain drive. And eventually in 1888, pneumatic tires were added to that as well by a doctor named John Dunlop, whose sickly son wanted to ride a bicycle and was tired of bouncing around, so he invented pneumatic tires. So what were wheelmen doing in the 1870s? What was wheeling like? Well, these wheelmen were parading around in smart uniforms, military style. They would ride in military cavalry unit formations. There was a bugler. There was a captain. In fact, he was the captain of the Rutland Club. They would go on tours and meet with other wheelmen. Some shops around wagon shops and toy shops around the state started converting some of their production to make bicycles, beginning in the 1880s. But these things were really expensive and out of reach for most people. So what happens is, as that bicycle shifts towards the safety bicycle and into the 1890s, industrial production of these things really picks up. And we see a bicycle craze like nothing else take storm beginning around 1890, 1891. And in Vermont, people take to the bicycle very eagerly. And in this time, the price of the bicycle is dropping, becoming more accessible to people. Women are taking to the bicycle and looking for unchaperoned freedoms. And the bicycle begins to occupy a place in people's imagination as the future of the transportation system of their world. And things are being built to accommodate this new machine. And the bicycle industry is a technological wonder. The American bicycle industry was at the cutting edge of all kinds of things. And I'll get into a little bit more of that later, but among other things, it was at the cutting edge of selling you the idea that you needed a bicycle. So bike retailing became a big phenomenon. And in Burlington, in the 1890s, there were 10 different dealers of bicycles. So Burlington has a population today of 42,000. Back then, it was about 19,000. Today, we have, 4 or 5 bike shops at best. They had 10 with half the population. And everybody was in the bike selling game. The hardware store, George Hager, he sold Victor and New bicycles. The diamond shop, the jeweler, watches, clocks, jewelry, optical goods, and bicycles. The electrical supply store had a bicycle department. And then we actually had a bicycle shop, Lane's Bicycle Livery, which had bike rental schemes. So you could come into Burlington and rent a bike for a day or a month or whatnot. But it was what one comic creator in 1897 described it as a bicycle mania. We all have it. This is a famous cartoon, by the way, from that year of 1897. And it's fun to look at because there's so many details in here that speak to the excitement around the bicycle and the ways in which the bicycle was being marketed. Bicycle National Bank, bicycle cigars, cures bicyclist diseases. Some of you have the bicycle disease comic. That's the pink one. We'll get into that later. But drink bicycle soda, eat bicycle food. So the bike was a real powerful, exciting, compelling thing for people. By 1910, the excitement around the bicycle really had begun to fade quite substantially. It wasn't that everyone had cars, right? People really didn't have cars in big numbers here in Vermont, at least until the 30s, the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. But the excitement around the bicycle was not sustained because people were like, wow, what's this new vehicle that's making its way into the world? And that's where the people who were early adopters of the bicycle started turning their attention to, was the car. But the bicycle was not just a fad. So that's kind of one of the big points I want to show you tonight. The bike wasn't a fad. It was part of some big enduring changes in our culture that we're still living with today. And one of them that fascinates me the most as an anthropologist is that people had an experience for the first time that they hadn't really had before with the bicycle. And it's something that we take for granted today, and that's the experience of effortless speed and automobility. So people, of course, had horses, and they had carriages, and they had trains. They could move distances, right? But of course, the horse got tired, and it had to be fed. The iron horse didn't. That's why they called it an iron horse. The train was thought to swallow you up on its own time frame, its own schedules, and you didn't have any real chance of automobility there. But suddenly the bike comes along, and people are, the wind through their hair and the pulsating heart and lungs, and that ability to kind of direct your bike wherever you want to go. And people literally did. So one of the most remarkable achievements of the 1880s was a guy named Stevens, a British guy, who came here to Vermont and gave a talk about this experience. He took one of those high-wheel bicycles and rode it around the world in the 1880s without roads. Much of the time he was spending on train tracks. And when he would go on a trestle bridge and there would be a train coming, he would have to literally hang there while the train is rumbling over and he's holding on to his bike. So people were trying to do new things with their bicycles. And so it was really an exciting time, and speed became a major fascination of the 1890s in particular. Bike racing was the NASCAR of its era. People were really into speed, and one of the maximum expressions of just how far they would take this was the 6-day race, and that was a bicycle race that would take 6 days. And people would drop, and so if you were a spectator, you would show up around day 4 or day 5, because that's when the spectacle really started. So people were really interested in that. Another thing was that I briefly mentioned the technological innovations of the bicycle industry. So a lot of famous automobile people got their start in the bicycle industry. So Henry Ford's a good example. He was a bicycle mechanic. And he was brought to the Columbia Bicycle Factory. Now, how many of you have had a Columbia bicycle? There's got to be at least several of you. So Columbia was the first American bicycle company. It was set up in a sewing machine factory in Hartford, Connecticut. Henry Ford was brought in on one of these sort of junkets where Columbia would bring in its dealers. And he saw something that blew his mind, which he saw that Thomas Edison had electrified the factory so that there was light 24/7, because they were at that level of production, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and an assembly line, a motorized assembly, electrified assembly line that was moving parts across the floor. We give Henry Ford a lot of credit for the assembly line mode of production, but it was the bicycle industry that was innovating that years before he got started. Ball bearings, steel tubing, all kinds of new techniques and new technologies were coming out of the bike industry. And it literally laid the groundwork for the automobile, technologically, legally. So for example, we didn't have speeding laws until the bicycle came around, and the automobile quickly did this. Roads began to improve. We give a lot of credit to the AAA, the American Automobile Association, for good roads. It was actually bicyclists who started all that, and they were bankrolled by the bike industry. So Columbia Bicycles invested very heavily in that. Women, of course, were taking to the bicycle and really challenging gender norms and ideas about what it means to be in public space as a woman. And a lot of that started with their clothing, the rational clothing movement, which said, hey, I can't ride a bike with these terribly restrictive clothes, or clothes that have so many layers of undergarments and so on. So the bloomer became a very popular clothing option for women. And there was a strong reaction against that, about the fears of loose women out on bicycles on the streets. And then people's ideas about the landscape. They're reading stories about this guy, Thomas Stevens, who's riding around the world. He's sending back missives about his travels. They're learning about the world, and they're also using the bicycle to get out of cities and to go into the White Mountains or the Green Mountains. And so Vermont became a very popular touring route from Boston up to Montreal, or from New York even. So ideas about landscape appreciation were really tied to the bicycle. new ideas about athleticism and the importance of exercise and leisure. All of this is really tied to the bicycle. It was also a very controversial thing, right? The bike provoked all kinds of conflict as bicycle riders were using them to, speed down the streets and scare horses and scorch. Some of you have the Scorcher comic, and we'll talk about scorching a bit. That was a real moral panic of the time. The clergy, for the most part, hated bicycles because people were spending their Sunday mornings on bicycle rides. There was an Indiana pastor who said, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So he had ride-in bicycle services. So there was a lot of social conflict. And then new diseases. There's all these new diseases that people are associating with the bicycle. Was the bicycle detrimental to your health? That was a big, enormous debate of the time. And one of my favorites, if those of you with the pink book will see on the first page, is bicycle face. And that's in that image, right? Bicycle face is up there. And bicycle face was thought to be the contortions that your face was frozen into from the struggle of holding a bicycle in balance. So it's like, ah! And it was targeted at women because it was thought that all these young emancipated women riding their bikes, if you tell them you're going to get ugly if you do that, they thought it might dissuade them from riding bicycles. So this talk, and what I'm going to go through, is sort of three elements of the bigger story of what happens when the bicycle comes to Vermont. And the first is the wheelmen. Who were they? Who were these gentlemen on bicycles? And the second section is the new woman. Why were women? Who were these women? What was their experience like riding bicycles? And then the last I want to talk about is roads, good roads, and the phenomenon of how we came to have the road system that we have thanks to bicyclists. And so, at the heart of this is a set of questions like, well, if you had a bicycle, where would you buy it? Where would you get it repaired? Where would you want to ride? What would that ride be like? Who would you encounter along the way? What were the politics of the bike back then? Because they occupied a lot of people's attention. So we'll start with the wheelmen. So the latter part of the 19th century was a time when, as a man, you were spending time in a fraternal organization of some kind. And there was a lot of joining going on back then. Civic organizations were a big thing. And wheelmen's clubs became a pervasive phenomenon, especially here, but all over New England and the upper Midwest and parts of the South, even out west. And a wheelmen's club was an organization that had a uniform. They had often a clubhouse. They were, as you'll see, trying to maintain a certain idea of what it means to ride a bicycle. And that was to ride it in a leisurely fashion with your mates, right, with your friends. And so wheelmen loved to go parading about. And this is the Bicycle Club of Swanton from posing with all of their bicycles in 1893. So wheel clubs, the two sort of areas where we see the biggest wheel club phenomenon is the Vermont Wheel Club was in Brattleboro. It was the longest running wheel club. It is apparently the second wheel club found in the United States. The first was the Boston Wheel Club. And the second is the Vermont Wheel Club. And they had very beautiful and elaborate building built for them. And the building still stands, but it doesn't have that opulence that it once had. And if you didn't even have to have a bicycle to be in this wheel club, you had to be an upstanding male citizen. And so the elite of Brattleboro and that region were all members of the Vermont Wheel Club, whether they rode or not. They had a baseball team and other things. They had stationery and they had fancy cutlery and things like that with their symbols on it. During the winter months, they would have a winter ball that was so politically important. All the important people from southern Vermont were there. that if you had any political aspirations on a statewide level in Vermont, you had to go to that winter ball. Some very important political figures came out of that world. In Burlington, there was also an early adoption of wheeling, and that being an important economic center of the state. These were also wealthy and important men. So here's the Burlington Wheel Club in 1886, posing with their high wheels in front of the Fletcher Free Library, which is now, that's right basically on Church Street, but from the park side, so the Park of Burlington. And what's interesting is that I looked at who were members of this club, and they were the most important figures in Burlington's economy, the publisher of the Free Press, and the important lawyers and political figures. But they all abandoned their bicycles within a couple of years, and they bought yachts. Because one of the things about the bicycle back then was this is how you showed your social status and your economic status. These were expensive. It'd be 6 months' wages for the typical worker to get a bike like that. So these are wealthy, elite men, and they were very exclusionary. They were quite exclusive about who could join and so on. So the first wave of wheelmen's clubs were not bringing in the clerks and the shopkeepers and so on. They were really the upper crust. But when the yacht club got established on Lake Champlain, it was like, forget the bikes, we're moving to yachts. Here's Joseph Wald. To just give you a sense of what some of these early wheelmen were like. Joseph Wald was the publisher of the Burlington Free Press. And he published a book, Picturesque Burlington. It came out in multiple editions. But it's an interesting book of photographs. And by the way, the wheelmen and cameras were closely tied. Wheelmen loved to show their connections to new technologies all the time. And when the camera became more available, they were bringing them with them and taking photos and such. And so the Picturesque Burlington book has a lot of landscape photos, scenic rides and drives around Burlington. And it was from his years as a wheelman that he learned all of these great roads for seeing beautiful sights and scenic vistas. And he doesn't once mention the bicycle in Picturesque Burlington, but knowing his background, that's how he was getting to see that countryside and then make recommendations about it. He was also a tinkerer, and a lot of these in the early years of the bicycle, there was a lot of tinkering happening. And so my version of bicycle technological history is an utter failure from the point of view of a wonderful exhibit that happened here at the Sheldon a few years ago that showed all of the different technological possibilities that the bike had in a period of its development. But he had a tricycle patent in 1883. This was registered in the patent office, the U.S. Patent Office. It was a gearing system for a tricycle. So he was involved in lots of different things in his life, and wheeling was an important one for him. Moving around the state, the Rutland Bicycle Club was founded in 1881, so it was also a very early club. What's interesting about the Rutland Club, though, is it pretty much disappears by 1885-86, so it didn't last long. But it has this spectacular story, which is that they founded in 1881. By 1884, they've raised a bunch of money to open a skating rink. So there was a really interesting connection between wheelmen and skating rinks. Wheelmen wanted a place to practice, and they wanted a place to teach others how to ride these unwieldy things. And so skating rinks were a natural environment for that. So the Burlington Wheel Club bought a skating rink, and then these guys decide they're going to build one. And it cost $15,000, opened on July 4th, 1884, to a whole lot of fanfare. It had 1,200 seats, 900 on the floor, and then another 300 up above. It had numerous chandeliers, each possessing 30 gas jets. And a year later, it sells for $2,325. Utter failure. So they thought that they would get back their investment from people roller skating, because roller skating was an emerging thing as well. But I guess the population of Rutland was not so compliant, and they put their energies elsewhere. And so this building basically became a warehouse and was eventually torn down. By the early 1900s, in fact, it had already been torn down. But here they are in 1885 posing. They made a trip down to Springfield, Massachusetts for a big meet of wheelmen. And they had races, and you can see they all have ribbons because they won some races. Down in Bellows Falls, the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club, so it turns out one of my friends, her great-grandfather was the president of this wheel club. I just found this out about a year ago, and I was like, oh, this says so much, because he was a lawyer. And they organized mock court trials. So the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club on Tuesday evening, July 31st is 1894. They're going to have a jury of 12 fellow townsmen, and they're basically trying a situation of our most respected citizens will be tried for the larceny of a Plymouth Rock rooster. And as it says, aside from the rare fun of the occasion, the entertainment will be exceedingly interesting to ladies and others who have never attended a real trial. So the wheelmen's clubs were more than bicycle riding groups. They held entertainment nights, and as these guys did, they had comic operas and plays, they had concerts and balls, which their ball was another one of those social events of the winter kinds of things. They had ladies' night. In the Upper Valley, there was a real profusion of bicycle interest as well. Woodstock was at the heart of a lot of that. But there were clubs in White River Junction, Lebanon, Claremont. These were clubs that were crossing the Connecticut and into New Hampshire all the time. And they would do a lot of parading in the Upper Valley, and a parade might bring in 500 cyclists. And so I want to read this little article. This is about a bicycle parade in Woodstock. I'll read this to you so you don't have to strain your eyes, because it'll give you a sense of what it was like to have a bicycle parade come into your town, this case in 1895. A bicycle meet and parade under the auspices of the Wabeno Cycle Club, they were the Woodstock Bike Club, was held at Woodstock last Friday afternoon and evening, and was a brilliant and successful affair. Stores and residences were elaborately decorated, and in the evening, the entire village was beautifully illuminated by over 3,000 Japanese lanterns. The Hartford and Lebanon cycle clubs and cyclists from adjoining towns were present. The Woodstock Railway Company running a special tram. About 200 wheels were in line, and the parade was witnessed by several thousand people. There was a fine display of fireworks in the evening. Woodstock Cornet Band discoursed music, and refreshments were served to all visiting cyclists and visiting friends in the town hall. So imagine, all these Japanese lanterns and the Woodstock Railway bringing those cyclists in. So some early bicycle advocates, today you can get on the Amtrak with your bike from Vermont. And that took years of current contemporary bike advocates to achieve. Back then, bike advocacy did that as well. They fought for the right to bring their bicycles onto trains, and they even won it to do it for free. So the bicycle train dynamic was really interesting. This is how you did a lot of touring. You would get your bike on a train and go someplace and then tour around there. There's another element of the Upper Valley story that's, I think, this is a little digression, but it's an interesting one. So here's a house. This is James Murdoch. He was basically a merchant in Woodstock. This is his house around 1900. Someone sent me this, and I was looking at this image, and I was like, why did they send me this? And then I looked closer, and I saw that. So this is a very odd bicycle. It's called a Star Rider. And the Star Rider has a very interesting connection to Woodstock. So the Star Rider, first of all, it's a transition bike between that high wheeler with the high wheel in the front, and it reverses the equation to make this bike a lot safer. And in fact, this bike was so safe that a guy named Hazlitt rode one of these things down Mount Washington. So this bicycle between 1881 and 1884 was the most expensive, the most advanced kind of, bicycle, and speed records were being broken on this thing. They played bike polo on this thing. This guy right here, the Tiger Woods of his era, John Stout, riding down the Michigan State Capitol steps with one of those things. A song was composed about the Star Rider.
Did it have brakes?
Yeah, these things had brakes. Typically the brake would be right here, and it was you would depress something and it would push down on that hard rubber wheel. So the connection to Woodstock is this, not just that we saw one there in 1900, but the guy who made these things, H.B. Smith, was born in Woodstock. And he started a career in Woodstock as a young man, basically making wood manufacturing equipment. And he was quite successful at it, and he moved to New Jersey, in Burlington County, New Jersey, and he basically bought a township and called it Smithville. And he created a big factory there where they made machines, and a guy who had the design for this shows up one day out of the blue and he says, "Do you think you could make this thing for me? I have this idea, I just don't know how to do it, and I don't have the factory to do it." So Smith was like, "Sure, why not?" So H.B. Smith manufactured these bicycles. So Woodstock plays an interesting role. And it raises another question, another digression of, well, were there bikes made in Vermont? The real heart of the American bicycle industry that was in two places. One, at least initially and for a long time, was New England, the sort of Connecticut River Valley, Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, and Hartford, Connecticut. That's where all the big Columbia and the big bike manufacturers were there. They were drawing on a tradition of, fine machinery, the armory tradition here in northern New England. And then Chicago was the other center eventually, and that was big farm equipment. So they were slightly different industries. But Vermont was a little bit off the beaten path of serious bike manufacturing, but it wasn't that people didn't try. There was a Bennington Bicycle Company. Here's their head badge. And if you're curious, you just go on eBay and you'll find sometimes one of these old Bennington bicycles will show up. There was one for $400, and it was like, don't even bid, just buy it. Somebody wanting to get rid of it. It was pretty thrashed. But you can get those. The Coolidge Cycle Company was in Rutland, and they had two bikes models. One was the Vermont and the Rutland. I would love to have a Vermont. Who knows? No one's ever found one as far as I know. The names of the Benningtons were the Tiffany Special and the Nelson Special. And there was a guy up in St. Johnsbury who was G.H. Payne, who was building bicycles as well. What about Addison County? So Addison County was quite active in wheeling. And there were clubs here in Virgins. There was the Athletics Association and the Star Bicycle Club were formed in the 1880s. And here in Middlebury, the Otter Creek Cycle Club, the aptly named Otter Creek Cycle Club, was formed in 1895. And there's a lot of newspaper articles in the Middlebury Register of their activities, their rides up to the runs, they would call them, run up to Burlington. All interested parties should meet at this shop, Clinton Smith, at such and such a day and such a time. We'll make a run up to Burlington. They sponsored races locally. But the trail runs a bit cold because really what occupied people's minds here in Middlebury, it was a small town, several thousand people as opposed to, the great cosmopolitan of Burlington of 19,000 people. And what occupied people here was national news about the way the bicycle was promoting good roads. And because people here were really worried about good roads, because a lot of people here were agriculturalists. They wanted to get their products to market. So there was a lot of coverage of bicycles, but it was mostly about how the wheelmen were promoting good roads. And we'll get to that more later. But people were definitely riding through here. One of the things that wheelmen did was they promoted orderly riding. Remember I said they were really interested in, riding around in military formation and such. And so you would see these things this is from the Free Press in Burlington in 1895, some sage words for cyclists: always keep to the right, always keep your wheel clean. In passing another rider or vehicle, keep to the right. Keep off crowded streets unless you have urgent business there. Don't forget that pedestrians have rights. It often saves bitter thoughts. And then I'll read this whole thing because this is really interesting. So the bicycle interrupted people's ideas about etiquette, right? Because you got all these people riding around and scaring horses and pedestrians. And how do you interact with other cyclists became a big concern. So this was a little bit from the United Opinion of Bradford, 1895. Every sport has its rules of etiquette, and a system of exchange of courtesies must be adapted to cycling conditions. A question that is causing a great deal of agitation relates to the mode of greeting among wheelmen and wheelwomen. Shall a man take his hand from the handlebar at the risk of taking a header in order to tip his cap? Or shall he merely nod his head and say, howdy? Shall a lady make a sweeping courtesy or merely nod? Instances are cited wherein men have tried to do that which they have been taught from childhood, and the result has been a hectic flush all over one side of their faces, where their skin was caressed by the loving but somewhat calloused hand of Mother Earth. Ladies who have bowed too profoundly have been picked up tenderly by helping hands after it was all over. It is with reason, therefore, that cyclists are giving this matter serious consideration.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why would they encourage bicyclists to pass on the right?
Oh boy, so that's a good question. This is me going into anthropologist mode because I've gotten this question from my students. Supposedly it goes back to the I'm going to screw this up, so don't even listen to me honestly. But it's had something about the Romans and holding a whip, and so you want to avoid the whip. So if the whip is mostly right-handed people, that means that the right side of the street is going to be for one. We're moving to the right side of the street for lanes, right? So bicyclists are sort of pushed further to the right and they're well, I'm going to screw it. Forget it. Forget it. I'm serious. There is a good answer somewhere for that. Okay, the other thing they did was they promoted racing. This was a big concern for wheelmen's clubs. The Mount Kilburn Wheelmen sponsored a race from Bellows Falls to Claremont, New Hampshire. There's a little description, and I'll pull out a few highlights. One of them was that a good share of the village showed up accidentally to watch the race. And it was a 40-mile race, and the winner came back in 2 hours and 9 minutes, which means there's an average of 20 miles per hour. That's really cruising, because that's hilly country, right? And so the speed at which people were riding these bicycles, and they were mostly single speed. They had brakes, but if you're averaging 20 miles per hour, that means you're flying down hills, and you got some really strong legs to get you fast up hills. And mishaps would happen in these races. This describes one. When at the top of Dean Hill, about 5 miles this side of Claremont, on the return trip, Henry Grignon broke the rim to one of his wheels and rode 2 miles farther before meeting his cousin, with whom he exchanged wheels. He then rode on to Charlestown, where he secured another mount and arrived third in the race in spite of the mishap. And feats of endurance. 2 crack Woodstock wheelmen. They set out one Sunday morning at 2:30 a.m. They rode 83 miles to Littleton, New Hampshire. Their goal was to turn back and head home, but they decided to keep on going to Woodsville, and they stopped in St. Johnsbury and spent the night, slept a few hours, and then returned home. They had already ridden 158 miles in 23 hours, took a short rest, and another 52 miles home. This is newsworthy business in 1894. So people were really testing their bicycles and their bodies, and wheel clubs really promoted that. But scorching is a real menace. So if there's an other to the wheelmen out there, it's the scorcher. Those of you with the gray comic, if you've looked at those stories of scorching, scorching was a real moral panic in the 1890s as men, young men primarily, sometimes, quite often working class young men who were not really being allowed into these wheelmen's clubs, were getting bikes as they were getting cheaper and cheaper. And they were riding not in formation, not in groups, not with their mates, but they're riding alone and they're going places fast. They're using bicycles for fun, for sure, but they're also using them for transportation. They're trying to get places fast. So scorching became a real concern. And this is the tenor of the reporting on that. This is in 1899 from the Free Press. Another accident occurred Tuesday evening as a direct result of the ever-present bicycle scorcher. And it describes, and that's the first comic in the gray comic. Is I decided, what would that look like? So this guy who ended up being, he was a bike mechanic at this shop. He was scorching down the street right in front of his own shop where he worked. And he ran over Barney Buxton, a boy of about 8 or 9 years old. Barney was unconscious, cut on the side of his head, his right arm seriously bruised. They called over Dr. Lyman. This is all in the article, by the way. And then the lad regained consciousness but was not able to remember anything about the accident. So the guy who was the scorcher, his name was Abner Lozo. He was a bike mechanic. He ended up owning his own bike shop. And about a year ago, somebody out of the blue emails me and says, I hear you know stuff about Burlington history. And I was like, yeah. I said, do you know anyone named Lozo? So I'm a relative. I'm a descendant of this guy, Abner Lozo. And I said, well, let me tell you about Abner. He ran over Barney Buxton. So wheelmen tried to get out in front of this scorching thing, and they didn't want the government to step in and regulate them. And so they came up with proposals for regulation of their own. There has been, this is from the Bellows Falls Times, 1897. There's been considerable complaint of fast and reckless riding. It is better that the wheelmen take the matter in hand themselves. We suggest that all wheelmen carry lanterns and bells and keep to the right side of the street, or on such bicycle paths may hereafter be provided. So they're trying to organize bicycle traffic themselves. And what's interesting is this is 1897. That was a really interesting year where all towns and cities in Vermont that year decided to create bicycle ordinances. And they're really interesting. And the bicycle ordinances say things like you have to have a light on your bike at night. You have to not be on the sidewalk downtown. You have to, in some cases, there's a speed limit for bicycles. So the wheelmen were quite aware that regulation was coming. And so they tried to get out ahead of it, but they didn't really succeed because the ordinances all came then. And they laid the groundwork for bike laws today. If you compare 1897 Burlington bike ordinance with today, it's pretty similar. The other thing that's noteworthy here is they talk about such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided. So this was another interesting moment in American history when the bicycle had so energized people and it had become a means of everyday transportation that people started imagining connections between towns as bicycle paths. And so there was a whole side path movement that emerged where cyclists would get permission to dig out a side path on the side of a road, and so the wagons could keep going uninterrupted. And so the side path movement, you would buy a ticket, basically, if you were visiting a side path that you weren't a member of, and you would be allowed to ride on that side path. So they were private in many cases, and up in St. Johnsbury, there was various side paths that the local cycle clubs started building to connect to neighboring towns. I haven't found any evidence in this area if they started doing that. But that was what they imagined the future of transportation to be, that we were going to get around by bicycles on these little paths that would connect us. There were other legal matters that concerned wheelmen. This is a little tidbit from 1896. It is next to impossible to safely steal a bicycle in Vermont. Except then you find these kinds of articles which talk about bike thieves. Here's one that talks about George Ashe. This is a college town, so you'll appreciate this. He was caught in White River Junction. He came from White River Junction, and he got a bike there, and he brought it to Chittenden County and sold it. And he claimed that a friend of his from Dartmouth College had given him the bicycle. And so-called friend never admitted to anything, and so George was brought into court in Windsor County. The value of the bicycle was $7. Today's money, that would be about $190. It's, not insubstantial. But he was found guilty and he was thrown into prison in Rutland for 3 months. So it says something about the value that people put on bicycles. These were still prestige objects. They were still important. Today, a bike thief isn't going to get 3 months. They'll get a slap on the wrist, perhaps, and maybe a fine. But back then, there was a sense that, these are important and expensive machines. So if you steal one, you're gonna pay the price. Now, what about the new woman? We'll shift gears. And this is from the Londonderry Sifter, 1897. This is a funny little cartoon. He, don't you think it rather risky to come this far alone on your wheel? She, hadn't thought of it, but if you feel timid, I'll see you home. So there was a very close relationship between, for example, the suffrage movement and the bicycle. The suffrage movement saw the bicycle as a tool of emancipation, and so Elizabeth Cady Stanton famously said, this is actually in your little lecture souvenir, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, the bicycle will inspire women with more courage, self-respect, and self-reliance, and will make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body. For feeble mothers do not produce great statesmen, scientists, and scholars. And so the newspapers here in Vermont really spend a lot of time working through what it means that women in this state are picking up on bikes. And this was in the Burlington Free Press. And there's a little tidbit called The Woman in the Wheel. The coming woman will be the woman whose mother rode a bicycle and thereby made herself fit to be the mother of the coming woman, says Ida Trafford Bell. There are 8 million bachelors in the United States. Watch the reduction in number as soon as the bicycle girl in bloomers is scattered over the land. And norms are being challenged. So gender norms are being challenged. And there's this little interesting tidbit also in the Free Press about how selecting a cycle teacher. So when you got a bike, you had to learn how to ride it. And Mark Twain famously has some funny thing that he said about a bicycle that basically he just kept on getting thrown off and he finally gave up. But this is how to select a cycle teacher. Most cycle depots will send up a man to teach any of their own customers. And many ladies have learned in this fashion. Personally, however, it seems to me that if one must clutch any male thing wildly by the neck and fall into his arms 10 or 20 times in the course of an afternoon, a relative or intimate friend is better than an unknown oily mechanic. And I should therefore counsel any girl who contemplates learning the safety to select her teacher with these unavoidable contingencies in full view. So a lot of the energy that women were putting into the bicycle, especially here in Vermont, was that it was about their right over their body, about their right to live a healthy life and to have exercise and not be constrained by restrictive daily patterns or restrictive clothing. And in 1892, there was a big conference here in Vermont on the rights of suffrage and the complete enfranchisement of women. And on page 1, there's a big article about the physical training of women. There's no discussion of the vote in this whole thing. That's not what they were concerned about. They were concerned, it was part of the broader set of concerns. But mind you, women had municipal suffrage here in Vermont. They couldn't vote in national elections or state elections, but they could vote in their town elections. There was a sense, at least among suffragettes here in Vermont, that womanhood in Vermont was already enjoying certain kinds of freedoms. They had the freedom of divorce. Women were, at the time, tourism is beginning to pick up, the whole sort of farm tourism. Women were often the face of that, interacting with tourists, collecting the money. They were becoming more economically important. So the focus of the suffrage movement here was a lot on physical training for women, and that's where their interest in the bike lay. It gave them an opportunity to get out and about and get healthy. But that it was a complex enthusiasm. This is a tidbit from the Orleans County Monitor. Miss Mayjune, do you believe in women's suffrage? Miss Janfeb, well, I haven't quite come to that yet, but I ride a bicycle. And, you know, these women here were Burlington's elite, the Wells ladies, the Wells family, Wells Richardson Corporation. They're the now right on College Street in Burlington, huge building. They were making pain celery compound, which until basically the FDA outlawed it as just tomfoolery and a terrible drug. It was one of Vermont's biggest exports to the rest of the world. It created a lot of wealth, and so the Wells ladies, who were not great suffragettes, they were out there on bikes quite a bit. But where the gender dimension became especially sharp was there was a health debate about bikes. As I had said earlier, there was this notion that the bike could be detrimental to your health, and it was targeted a lot at women. But the health debate plays out in the newspapers as well. So the best RX is a ride. Take it instead of going to the druggist. There was a lot of that. You know, get out there, your body will take care of itself if you just ride a bike. And it was called hygiene. So bicycling hygiene was the way they talked about it. Hygiene being healthy living. And so there's this article in the Free Press that talks about that bicycling hygiene. It opens up the pores, which should be treated with ablutions of water. So I guess splash yourself with water. That you should know how to breathe, because breathing through the mouth can cause heart troubles. And be sure your mouth doesn't get parched. It can affect digestion. So drink milk with a few drops of rum in it before a ride. So there's the health advice in the Burlington Free Press. But there was a really sharp reaction to a lot of this too. And this is one of my all-time favorites. This is a story about, this was in the Free Press in 1895. This is about Dr. Heine Marx, and he was a former superintendent of a hospital in St. Louis. And he came out strongly against the bicycle, as many, many doctors were. So this is his description of what happens if you ride a bike. First, you have a kind of paralysis of the hands and contraction of the chest. This causes congestion of the lungs and leads to consumption. That's like tuberculosis. Furthermore, with men, rupture, varicocele, hydrocele follow, and worst of all, it destroys virility. With women, riding promotes amorous desires. Married women are especially liable to very serious mishaps. If the world is not depopulated by the rapidly increasing membership of this suicide club, the human race will die out by reason of lack of manhood and inability to propagate.
Could that be ironic?
Not at all. No. In fact, so I invite you to, if you haven't looked at it, if you didn't get it, I invite you to look at this pink one, because these are the bicycle diseases. And as you'll see, I put my sources in here. This is all serious business. The Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, they came out against bicycling. It's just a teeny little tidbit in here. They said, this is published in JAMA. The bicycle is a nuisance and a curse instead of a blessing. And they were especially concerned about cyclist neuralgia, which is the pummeling of the perineum. And that led to, we'll just cut to the chase. For men, it leads to early impotence. And for women, it leads to the inability to propagate and spinsterhood. This was published in the medical journals. So the health debate was often, it was really, as you can see here, it's targeted at women. The bicycle face phenomenon especially was, bicycle foot was seen to be a disease of women because they were wearing fashionable French boots and not able to mount the bicycle and pedal it properly, it was thought. So they would develop, their ligaments would apparently just blow open, according to bicycle foot theory. So what about the roads? This is my last little section, and we can talk and I can answer questions. So the roads were abysmal. They were a mess. They still are, of course, in certain places. But you can see this is an image of that the Vermont Highway Commission wrote a report on the state of roads in Vermont. And you can see what's up with our poor cyclists and the people with the cart. And the way we managed roads historically was that these folks who lived along here were in charge of maintaining that road. And oftentimes when they would dig out their fields, they would throw rocks. They would throw all that stuff they wanted to get out of the land. They'd throw it onto the road, and then it would just get pounded in. The best roads in the state were toll roads, right? But most roads were obviously not toll roads. And so it was just a patchwork of some okay roads and some very, very terrible roads that the people who lived adjacent to the road didn't do much with. And so wheelmen, this was one of their first concerns right off the bat was, well, if we're going to enjoy our bicycles, we need to have access to some good roads. So what are we going to do about that? So in 1880, at a meetup of wheelmen in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, this was from all over the Northeast, they decided that they would do two things. One is they would start a national organization called the League of American Wheelmen, now known as, it still exists, it's the League of American Bicyclists. And that organization would promote the legal rights of bicyclists, and it would also promote good roads. And the second thing they would do is they would create a thing called the League of Good Roads. And the League of Good Roads was solely focused on promoting the improvement of our nation's roads. And this was all bankrolled by the Columbia Bicycle Company. Colonel Albert Pope, who was the founder of this, was very concerned about this. He was a very clever businessman, and he saw his future was in question if people couldn't ride out and enjoy themselves. So the road problem was a central problem for bike riders, and they took it on with gusto. In the early years, the way you would sort of figure out where you wanted to ride was you would get a book like this. This is a really interesting book by a guy named, well, his nom de plume was Carl Krohn. His real name was Lyman Bagg. I actually kind of like Lyman Bagg. I think that's a great name. He wrote a book called 10,000 Miles on a Bicycle. He came here to Vermont when he was writing it. And what he did was he rode around and he would figure out, well, where are the wheelmen? I'm going to go meet with the wheelmen and I'm going to ask them, where do you ride? What's a good ride? And then I will record it in my book. And if you pay me $5, I will send you the book when I'm done. And that will be a guide for you when you want to go out to new areas and ride in new places. So this book is really thick. And it's got descriptions of rides all over the Northeast and Upper Midwest. And it has a list of all the subscribers. And so if you want to know who were the wheelmen who he talked to in 1886, 85 in Vermont, their names are all there. It's really interesting to find out who was interested in riding. And he's got little tidbits about Vermont. And so if anyone asks you, when was the first century ride ever ridden in Vermont? This has the answer. The longest day's ride previously taken in Vermont was on July 9th, 1883 by two Rutland boys, W. Eggleston and N.S. Marshall, 100.5 miles. And then what he does is he describes his ride. He rode from Bellows Falls to Montpelier and Burlington, and he calls the roads as a whole fair. He talks about some fine stretches, some unrideable, some patches of sand. So this book is full of this stuff. And then the League of American Wheelmen started publishing road books. And here's 1887 Road Book of New York. And it talks about a ride right through Addison County. So if you wanted to go from Brandon all the way up to Burlington, it would lead you through Middlebury, New Haven Depot, Virgins. Talks about the condition of the roads, clay, loam, what's the distance, little notes over here to the side. So you would purchase this. And these things are still around. You can get a hold of these. A lot of libraries have these things. But if you didn't have a road book, you were probably pretty lost. You were just, you would have to figure out what am I going to do. But these road books were really helpful. And they created maps. And so, wheelmen's maps were really, really common. And there's some really interesting ones of Vermont. The vision behind the good road. So Albert Pope, he was out front on this whole road issue. He says, an eminent writer says, the road is that physical sign or symbol by which you will best understand any age or people. If they have no roads, they are savages. For the road is the creation of man and the type of civilized society. So in a lot of the writings about the road movement and justifying good roads, there's this really quite racist sense, like, well, the Incas had good roads, and they still exist, and like they're inferior to us. Why can't we just get it together and build good roads? That was the tone. And then, so Pope created a giveaway, 100 Columbia bicycles given away if you write an essay on the importance of good roads. Every student is invited and urged to enter the contest. And it was the road department of the Pope Manufacturing Company. So Columbia Bicycles had a road department. And wheelmen took to the roads themselves and protest rides. You know, and so here's an interesting one, a good roads trip to Ausable Chasm in the mid-1890s. And look at this little detail. This is a guy dressed like a frog. And he has a good roads statement on there. It's hard to make out, but you can clearly see good roads. So, you know, the idea that you'll band together in sort of, you know, critical mass. This is like 1890s critical mass. So Vermont was at the forefront of responding to that concern. And Vermont is the first state in the country to pass a highway act in 1892. And it means that centralized control is begun over roads. The state and the municipalities are now going to take control of roads. They can issue new property taxes that they'll distribute as aid back to towns. Towns can issue bonds. And a state highway commission is established. And they're the ones who did that study that shows that terrible road. So Vermont is at the cutting edge of good roads. And the governor at the time, Levi Fuller, he was known in the United States as the road governor. And he was from Brattleboro. If you remember back, the Vermont Wheel Club was exceedingly important to any politician's life. And so Levi Fuller's two brother-in-laws were high-level people in the Vermont Wheel Club. So you can imagine every time they saw him at a holiday, they're like, Levi, roads, we want good roads, right? So he pushed it through when he became governor, and then he became a national celebrity in the roads movement, good roads movement, and so Vermont's at the cutting edge of that. Now,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Was there a statewide property tax to finance what they say there?
I don't think it was statewide, no. I think it was connected to towns and cities.
Thank you.
But in 1900, a new vehicle starts showing up. You know, if in 1884 we're talking about a bicycle going down Mount Washington, by 1899 we're talking about a car climbing Mount Washington. F.O. Stanley. The Vermont Motor Company was established in 1902. In 1903, Horatio Nelson Jackson makes a historic bet. Does anyone know this story? It's for those of you who don't, it's great. So Horatio Nelson Jackson, he was a doctor in Burlington who was having a bit of a midlife crisis, and he went out to San Francisco, and he was out there with some guys, and this is like in 1903. And they're playing cards and drinking, and they're talking about cars, new cars. Automobiles are starting to show up. And he says, you know what, I bet I could drive across the United States in one of those. And they're like, oh, Horatio, no way. Put your money where your mouth is. So they make a bet of $50. The next day he goes out and he buys a little car. And he starts driving, and he makes it to New York City a few months later. And so Vermont plays a bit role in the first automobile trip across the United States. So he comes back, and of course he's a big booster of cars. And meanwhile, those Wells ladies, those are his relations. They were like, yeah, forget the bike, Horatio. We're coming with you to the car. So the Burlington Automobile Club is established in 1905. The Gentlemen's Driving Club in 1910. And you can see it in the parades. Here's a 1902 parade, 4th of July. So beginning in the 1880s, the bicycles were at the heart of the 4th of July parade. But by 1902, 20 years later, you've got automobiles entering, right? So automobile bicycle horribles. You know what horribles are?
What are horribles?
Horribles, it's a kind of a New England clowning tradition, actually. It's a parade where people dress up like politicians and the elite, and make fun of them. And you know, not just them. They would have grotesque costumes, as they would describe it.
Bread and puppet.
Yeah, like bread and puppet. So if you sort of follow the story now, so the newspapers are full of all these different details about bicycles and bike culture and bike politics. After 1910, it becomes this: boy struck by auto, auto and boy collide, killed by auto. Right? They become stories about bikes getting run over by cars. So it's an old conflict, this bike cars business. We've been trying to work through it since 1910 or so. But most people don't get cars until, as I said earlier, the 1930s, 40s. And the bike still is there. The bike doesn't ever disappear. But it really increasingly becomes a kid's toy, right? And many of you know that, right? When you were growing up, it was your mode of freedom. It was your connection as a young person to the broader community. And yet, even in Vermont, people were still riding, men and women were still riding bicycles. They were touring through the 1940s. They were using them to deliver things, right? But the story is no longer so one of excitement around the bicycle. It's more of a toy. It's more of a recreation thing. And that is the end of my talk. And if you haven't, thank you. I'm always looking for photos and stories, and if you have any, please, I'm interested to see them. And if you have any questions.
Yes. I wonder if you'd like to talk a couple of sentences to the comparison, the necessity of, and the bicycle and the rowboat. They're so unique in all history. We really can't duplicate either one of them.
The bicycle and the rowboat, that we can't surpass them.
Not yet.
Not yet.
But they tried. Human propulsion for gliders.
Yeah.
All,
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Those two items, for some reason or other, can't seem to be beat yet.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I will say this about the bicycle. I won't say a word about the rowboat. I'm more clever than that. I'll fall into another trap. The bicycle is not a single thing, right? And so the story of the bicycle, as I just touched on how there was a period of like lots of different versions of the bicycle. But if you want speed, efficiency, comfort, the bike that we know today is not the right version of that, right? It's actually a tricycle that is like they call them velomobiles these days. And so one of my questions as a scholar was, why are we all riding this diamond frame thing that we all complain about our hands, we complain about our butts, and our feet go numb, right? When you have this smug group of like engineers who are like riding around on their velomobiles, like, yeah, I didn't spend much energy to get here, but I got here fast, right? Because it's more efficient. It's a better use of the human body. It's much more comfortable. So what happened there? Well, there were some cultural ideas that were attached to the tricycle and the bicycle that differentiated them as early as the 1880s. So the tricycle, I didn't even talk about tricycles. Tricycles were actually quite popular. And the British royal family rode around on tricycles in the 1880s. So they became something that everyone wanted. But at the same time, you have this high wheel thing. And to ride one of those required serious mastery. And the way they talked about it, it was sportiness. You were sporty if you could master that. And so the real prestige was not on riding a tricycle. It was on riding a big, difficult thing to balance. So if you could do that, then you were cool, right? And so the meaning that we have today of tricycles is for like people at the extreme ends of life. It just lands right there, right? But the tricycle can be faster. It can be, easier. It's certainly easier on the body. But what happens later is those cultural ideas are cemented early on. Later, what happens, it's really in the 1920s. The bike industry realizes that one of its key marketing tools to sell more bikes is to promote racing and to sponsor teams and all that. And there were certain very powerful bike makers who had so invested heavily in that diamond frame thing, and their racers kept on getting beaten by tricycles. And so the UCI, the International Union of Cycling, in something like 1928 or 29, outlaws tricycles from bike racing because they kept winning. They were faster. And that was all because of industry pressure. So we all ride a bike that could go faster, it could be more comfortable, but the way the industry took shape is it congealed around this one particular form for lots of technological and political reasons and economic reasons. Yeah. You have a question?
When did the coaster brake come in?
The coaster brake. So that is not early, I can say that. People were not doing coaster brakes in the 1800s. I want to say it was probably the 1920s or 30s. The way you stopped a bike for the longest time was there was like a spoon that was resting just on the bottom of your fork above the tire. And you would depress something, and then that spoon would go wonk, and it would just slow you down. So you can see that with a lot of these old bicycles. They still, that's how they stop you. They tore up the wheel. Yeah.
I was curious about the origin of the recumbent, the bicycle recumbent. Did it come out of the tricycle shape? Or?
Oh yeah, the recumbent bicycle came out of that. Peugeot was an interesting company because Peugeot had not decided that there was a car or a bike. They wanted to do both, and Peugeot was always experimenting. Throughout the early 1900s, they were coming up with lots of commercialized versions of wheeled vehicles. And they had, semi-recumbent type little automobile type things. They had motors, some of them, others were pedals. The recumbent's been around a long time. It kind of comes and goes, though. I think the recumbent bicycle is enjoying some prestige now among that. I want to get places fast set.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I might offer a solution to why you might pass on the right.
Okay.
Most people had a buckboard, and they drove, if you will, from the left. Now, why you might be on the left of the buckboard is because you wouldn't want your lady friend to walk through the mud to get to her seat. She could just get on. So if that is true, if you're passing and you have a whip, you mentioned, you're not likely to whip across your girlfriend, the guy riding shotgun. So if you're over on the right, you're farther away than you would be on the left. The only people that would get whipped that were on the left would either be Ben-Hur or Marcella.
Sounds good to me. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you think the lessons are for the future? I love the focus on good roads and what you feel people will be doing today.
We're already doing a lot of what they did. That's the interesting thing to me. Another way I could have opened this talk, which I do elsewhere, closer to Burlington, is usually I'll describe Burlington today, what everyone thinks is Burlington today by bike. Politicians are concerned with it. There's valet bike parking at the local theater. There's class conflict around the bicycle. I describe all this stuff, and then I'm like, does that sound familiar? And Burlington was just like, yeah, that does. And I said, well, that's the 1890s, right? There's bike clubs promoting, advocating for good roads, So I think we're trying to do a lot. We're repeating a lot of what they tried. What's interesting is there was a period where they went much farther than we probably could because they weren't competing with the automobile yet. And so that whole path movement was one version of that. Big cities, New York, Chicago, they were reimagining their traffic as streetcars and bicycles, and that horses were eventually going to sort of be not part of that whole scene. Horses were a total mess. Bikes were seen as this liberating thing because horses are crapping everywhere and like leaving all kinds of dust, and so people were dreaming of how do we get rid of the horse, and the bike was seen as the solution to that. So So city planners, there was this, it's just this really interesting moment, really, a blip. 1895, 96, 97, 98. City planners are saying, all right, let's plan for bicycle highways. Let's make bicycle parks. Our whole system's going to be oriented around that. So when it comes to sort of concrete lessons, it's hard. The past is another country, as they often say, and so the context of how they made decisions and so on is quite different today. I think we can take inspiration from some of those accomplishments. I mean, I would love, for example, to see contemporary bicycle advocates study how they got Levi Fuller to sign that, to push through that good roads legislation. What was involved in that whole process? Who were they influencing? Who are they talking to? Right? We kind of see it as bottom up, get more people on bikes, and that'll eventually push. They didn't see it that way. They're like, start at the top, influence the decision makers, get in their face. So, the bike advocacy was relentless back then. And some of that had to do with their privileges. They were wealthy men, white men, and they could go to their peers and say, I want you to make better roads. So there was not, there's a big open wound of a diversity question in this period. And so today we have a lot more diversity, obviously, of people who use bicycles, racial, ethnic, gender, and so on. But the real open wound that I'm talking about is the League of American Wheelmen in the early 1890s had a split. In the North, and especially in Boston, there was an African-American wheelmen's club called the Riverside Wheel Club. They were, Major Taylor, the famous bike racer, had moved to Massachusetts so that he could race without being threatened. And so Massachusetts in particular was very hospitable towards African-American bicyclists. And there was a woman there, a woman who had a white father and a black mother, Kitty Knox, who was a super famous racer, and she was winning all kinds of races. And the southern chapters of the League of American Wheelmen did not like that at all. And they went to the National Convention in 1893-94, I think, but the decision was made in 1894, so it was probably 1893. They went to the National Convention, they said, you either get rid of the blacks or you lose the good roads support. We will break off, and you will not have a powerful movement for good roads anymore. So the northern here in Vermont, you can imagine the struggle that people were having over that. And there's a lot in the newspapers about that in 1894 that it was being reported. It was called the color bar. And so after that, the League of American Wheelmen said, no, blacks can't be members, women can't be members. And so, it was interesting, the League of American Bicyclists, which was the LAW, it wasn't until 1996 that somebody looked into the founding documents and saw that color bar still was in the constitution of the organization. Yeah, it was a terrible, embarrassing moment for the League of American Bicyclists.
What do you think about the rail-to-trail movement? Are you encouraged by that? Converting abandoned rail lines into bike paths?
Yeah, until we decided that train travel is really useful. I mean, that's kind of I like it. I think it's great. It comes out of 1970s environmentalism and scenic sort of scenic appreciation and connecting that with exercise. I think it's tremendous. At some point, though, if we want to bring trains back, we're really going to limit ourselves if we do that. I mean, I don't know if there's an easy solution. I will say this: if you're interested in the history of the Burlington bike path, the politics of the Rails to Trails movement was worked out here in Vermont. There was a fight that made it all the way to the Supreme Court around could the town or the city basically expropriate a landowner who claimed part of the rail bed without compensating them. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and It required the city of Burlington to pay someone who claimed to own some of that rail bed, but it also allowed the city to go ahead and with the rails to trails thing, and that was a critical thing nationwide. It was a set of precedents so that rails to trails are possible, that cities can and towns can, government can expropriate to do that. So it does continue quite at a brisk pace. I mean, you know, it's yeah. So I think it's generally speaking a good thing, but there's a trade-off. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, was there kind of you say that the popularity ended around, you know, 1905 or 10. Was there a resurgence of interest in bicycles, say like in the 20s, late 20s?
So
I ask because in the mid-50s, a bunch of kids in my neighborhood decided we're going to have a bicycle racetrack. And then suddenly everybody sort of went back in their barns and found these old racing bikes. I don't know where they came from, but everybody seemed to have one or two in their barn. So was it from the 20s?
In the 20s there was a bit of a racing scene that was happening, and it was a lot. Some of it was inspired by what was going on in Europe. You were starting to see the rise of racing in Europe. You know, the Tour de France, for example, was early 1900, 1901, I think is the year it started. So there was a culture of bike racing growing in Europe, in parts of Europe. In Denmark and Holland, they were not. In fact, in Holland, they outlawed racing. Bikes were for touring and for transportation. They weren't for racing. But I think in the United States, there were little pockets here and there of bike racing. But during World War II, there was a resurgence of the bicycle in the United States. People were using bikes a lot to transport themselves. You know, obviously to save resources for the war effort. And then the big one was, you know, when Eisenhower had his heart attack, his doctor was this Boston heart surgeon or cardiologist who rode a bike. And he got us thinking that we need to exercise more. And that will be for heart health. And that was laying the groundwork for then what happened you know, in the 70s. And that's when the 10-speed comes, right? It comes from Europe, basically. And that's when the oil crisis happens. And so that's considered to be the second bike boom. The first bike boom being this period I was talking about. The second one is really the 1970s. But yeah, I think there were little pockets. You know, I've given this talk all over Vermont, little towns, and I remember I was in Pollitt. And Pollitt had, their historical society invited me, and their historical society is in a cemetery. And there was this guy who shows up at the back of the room before the talk, and someone summons me and says, "Hey, you got to go talk to that guy. He's a farmer. He's got this really old bike from like 1935. And he's telling me about this bicycle, and it was a really interesting bike, and it's a Columbia." And so I start giving the talk, and 5 minutes into the talk, he says, my hand goes up. I'm like, yeah? He's like, "Can I talk about this bicycle yet?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay, sure, yeah, talk about your bike." So like he just expands. Like, "Oh, well, you know, this is my dad's bicycle. He's laying right over there. He would love us to hear us talk about his bicycle." So I've come across lots of situations like this, and what I found is that, you know, all across Vermont, there were these little pockets of bicycle renaissances happening all throughout the 20th century. You know, I found all these letters in the Historical Society in the 1940s of young people who were going on bike tours. You know, I'm going off to college in the fall, I'm going to do a bike tour of Vermont. You know, so that was a thing. You know, VBT, Vermont Bicycle Tours, they actually started in like 1950s or something like that. No, they started earlier than that. No, they became known in the
VBT?
VBT.
You have the founder.
Oh, are you the founder? No, why did I hear that like in the 1950s there was formal bike touring happening in Vermont?
Well, I don't know whether there was or not, but there was a commercial bicycle tour going end to end. I don't believe anywhere in the country until 1972, when we started it here.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig around for those letters and stuff. It would be interesting to you to sort of see that history of bike touring.
Yeah.
Because it's been here. I mean, 1880s, they're coming. And they're looking at the Green Mountains, and they're stopping at inns, they're stopping at, these League of American Wheel books had advice on where to stay.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Any other questions? I know we've been going long, yeah.
You never mentioned, I don't think of hearing.
Hearing, yeah.
I mean, my first memories of watching my brother fix his 10-speed Bavaria. Going around like
Yeah.
that,
So gearing happened very early on. I mean, it wasn't bone shakers, but the high wheels, they had gearing systems in the hub. So internal gears, they were expensive and they were rare, but at the Sheldon there were a few examples of that when that exhibit happened. So gearing kind of comes and goes. But the cheap bicycle, the accessible bicycle didn't have gearing. It was just too expensive. Yeah. But see, that just, to me, I'm all the more impressed by what people were doing. They were riding single-speed bikes up these massive mountains. And I'll just return to the very beginning. So, I'm sorry, you didn't see this because we had the other thing up there, but you have to see the very opening slide. Sorry. This is a New York Times article, July 1896. The bicycle in Vermont. Many pleasant tourings for the rambling wheelman. Roads are not all uphill. Well, I want to thank you all. I appreciate your intention and questions. And